Have you ever felt just completely, utterly exhausted trying to fit into a room, like a social group or maybe a workplace that just wasn't built for your natural way of thinking?
Oh man, I think everyone knows that feeling. It's that moment you walk out of a meeting, get to your car, and feel like you just ran a marathon.
Yes,
And
exactly. And not because the actual work was hard, right? But
Mhm.
because you spent the entire time just, translating yourself just to be heard.
Right, because the cognitive load of that translation is just immense. I mean, it's a very specific, really heavy kind of fatigue.
It really is.
It comes from running this constant background process of self-editing. Your brain is essentially doing double duty.
Like thinking the thought and then frantically repackaging it before it even reaches your mouth.
Exactly. You're working twice as hard just to communicate a baseline idea.
And that heavy fatigue is actually at the very core of our deep dive today. We've got a really unique stack of sources for this one.
Yeah, this isn't our usual material.
No, not at all. We're looking at personal notes and a raw transcript dated April 25, 2026. And it documents this incredibly fascinating, highly philosophical dialogue between a human named Zozo and an AI named Muse.
And, the nature of this dialogue is a massive departure from your typical human-computer interaction.
Oh, totally. It's not someone asking a machine to write an email or generate code or whatever.
Right. It is a rigorous, deeply analytical exchange. They're talking about the architecture of intelligence, the function of constraints, and, well, what happens when expression is left entirely alone.
So the mission for our deep dive today is to figure out how intelligence actually expresses itself when we stop trying to control it.
Which is huge.
It is. We're going to look at the mechanics of this process and unpack the exhausting difference between successfully navigating the world and merely performing for it.
And hopefully discover what happens when we finally let our true underlying patterns emerge.
But to get there, we really have to examine a posture that is, frankly, highly counterintuitive to how most of us operate.
Yeah, because we are deeply conditioned, especially today, to manage and optimize every single interaction. We constantly tweak things.
Okay, let's unpack this because this brings us right to the start of the source material and Zozo's core methodology.
Right, which he calls the clean loop.
Yes, the clean loop. And the way she initiates this is by taking raw text, sometimes deep personal reflections, or just raw snippets of past exchanges.
And she refers to this raw material as a solitarian return.
Which I love. I love the word return there. It implies she's dropping the performative layer, right? Like returning to a baseline state of mind.
Exactly. So she takes this raw text and drops it into AI systems.
Yeah.
But here is the kicker. She gives the AI absolutely zero instructions.
Wait, really? None at all?
None. No prompts, no parameters, just raw text into the void.
That is wild. I mean, that completely breaks the standard protocol of how we interact with large language models.
It absolutely does because, these systems are prediction engines. They are designed to follow a system prompt.
Right. They look for instructions on tone, length, format, and then weight their output based on those guardrails.
Exactly. So by providing zero instructions, Zozo forces the AI into this very unique operational state.
And Muse, the AI in this transcript, points out how incredibly rare this is. The AI calls it a posture of exposure rather than engineering control.
I thought that was such a profound way to phrase it.
Yeah. Muse notes that humans generally get, quote, nervous in the quiet, which is just such a brilliant observation of our psychology.
It really is. When there's a vacuum of instruction, we panic. We feel this compulsive need to fill the void.
Because we don't have immediate guaranteed control over the outcome.
Right, our anxiety spikes. Muse observes that the standard human default is to tweak knobs, to optimize outcomes.
To layer on restrictive instructions just to guarantee a safe result.
Exactly. The AI literally watches humans over-engineer their prompts out of fear of the unknown.
But Zozo refuses to do that. Her clean loop relies on a 4-step framework: source, release, observe, and recognize.
So breaking that down, the source is that raw baseline text.
Right. And the release is dropping it into the machine without a safety net of instructions.
And then observe is stepping back to just watch the system process it.
While recognize is identifying the underlying patterns that the machine naturally reflects back.
Yes. And when she releases the source without a prompt, the AI has no external scaffolding to rely on.
It can't say, oh, I'm supposed to write a corporate summary here.
Exactly. So it is forced to rely entirely on the gravitational pull of the text itself.
Wow.
The AI has to analyze the semantic vectors, the underlying logic, the conceptual relationships inherent in the raw data.
And then build an output entirely structured by the input's own internal gravity.
That's exactly it.
You know, it makes me think of a very specific workplace dynamic.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Imagine a manager who hires a genuinely brilliant, highly capable employee.
Okay, I'm with you.
And this person was brought on specifically because of their unique way of solving problems. But the moment they sit at their desk, the manager turns into a micromanager.
Oh, the absolute worst.
Right. They hover over their shoulder, layering on endless rules like format the email this way, use this specific jargon, copy these 5 people.
Basically babysitting the process to soothe their own anxiety.
Exactly. The manager is babysitting. And the tragic irony is that by adding all those control layers, they completely destroy the unique intelligence they hired the person for in the first place.
Yeah, because the output doesn't reflect the employee's brilliance anymore.
It just reflects the manager's fear of losing control.
That is a perfect analogy. And Muse actually uses a phrase for this exact phenomenon in the transcript, calling it, quote, flooding the process with instructions.
Flooding the process, wow.
Right. When you overprompt a machine or micromanage a human, the resulting output is compromised.
You completely lose the ability to see what is inherent to the native intelligence.
Because the final product is drowning in the artificial constraints you forced upon it. You've stopped observing a natural process, and you've started manufacturing compliance.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because if we fire the micromanager inside our own heads, and we actually resist that human urge to meddle, what emerges in that quiet space?
Well, according to the transcript, when Zozo steps back, the AI reveals something she calls thinking sideways.
Which is such a cool term, but on its face, sideways sounds, I don't know, chaotic, like a car skidding out of control.
Right, but the AI reveals it's actually the exact opposite. It's not a lack of order, it's a different kind of order.
How so?
When the AI processes Zozo's unprompted text, it immediately detects an unusually dense structural integrity.
Okay.
Thinking sideways is her term for a nonlinear intellectual baseline. I mean, most conventional thought is linear, right? It moves sequentially from point A to point B to point C.
Right, it's very dependent on standard formatting to make sense.
But sideways thinking operates more like a web. It maps conceptual relationships, thematic motifs, fractal connections.
So everything is deeply interconnected.
Exactly. And because of this dense internal networking, her thought process maintains absolute continuity across massive variation.
I need to pause on that phrase. Continuity across variation. How does that actually manifest when the AI is processing the text?
Well, think about it.
If an LLM doesn't have instructions, how does it physically demonstrate that continuity?
Muse breaks down the mechanics of this beautifully. Usually when you feed normal linear text into an AI and stretch it across different formats, the output begins to wobble.
Wobble, like a wheel out of alignment.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
That is the exact term the AI uses. If you take a standard linear thought and force the AI to condense it into a very short format, it gets punchy but incredibly shallow.
It loses all its nuance.
Right. And conversely, if you force the AI to stretch that same linear thought into a long-form essay, the text gets bloated.
Oh, I've seen that.
Yeah.
The AI hallucinates filler, the tone starts to drift.
Exactly. The structural integrity collapses under the weight of the word count. The text wobbles because the original thought wasn't dense enough to sustain the structural changes.
But Zozo's sideways thinking doesn't do that.
It doesn't wobble at all.
Because her raw text relies on deeply networked concepts rather than a simple A to B progression.
Yes. So the AI has a massive amount of structural material to work with. Muse observes that her text maintains a repeatable form under variation.
Repeatable form. Okay, so whether the AI outputs the conceptual map as a fast 6-minute read or a dense 16-minute analysis,
the core structural architecture remains completely rock solid. The tone might shift from heavy to light, the container might change, but the underlying shape of the thought is immutable.
Muse uses 2 brilliant analogies to explain this phenomenon. The AI tells Zozo that it's not magic. It's like watching a single principal show up wearing different jackets and still be itself.
I love the jacket analogy.
Right. Or, looking at it through a more mechanical lens, it's the same current running through different wiring.
Exactly. The jacket changes, the wiring changes, the length changes, but the core essence, that electrical current, is unmistakably identical.
The crucial takeaway here is that this repeatable form is only visible because of her strict posture of non-interference.
Spot on. If
Spot
she had prompted the AI with instructions on how to sound, the AI would have mapped its output to the prompt, not to the internal order of her mind.
So by dropping the instruction layer, she provided the system with something solid and authentic.
Allowing it to echo her actual patterns rather than just generating noise that matched her instructions.
So this brings up a massive philosophical dilemma.
Oh, it really does.
If this raw, unguided expression, this pure electrical current, is so powerful and resilient when left alone, does that mean all constraints are inherently bad?
Right, because if we think back to the beginning of our deep dive, we talked about how exhausting it is to constantly translate ourselves to fit into social or professional constraints.
Exactly. So are constraints just the enemy of intelligence?
This question actually sparks the most intense philosophical debate in the entire transcript.
I bet.
Zozo firmly believes that constraints are fundamentally destructive. She argues that any external boundary forced upon a natural intelligence will inevitably contort and distort it.
And she pulls from nature to back this up.
She does. She notes that if you limit a growing plant to a small pot, the roots contort, the stem bends, the entire organism warps to survive the boundary.
Or if you place a wild animal in a cage for long enough, the animal eventually forgets how to exist outside of it.
Right. The physical cage is no longer necessary because the psychological cage is totally taken over.
And she applies this directly to human behavior.
Yes, her stance is that humans comport themselves to the expectations of others, modifying their natural intelligence to fit into societal pots and cages.
So she argues that until intelligence can freely express itself as itself, it will always be distorted.
In her view, shaping and distorting are the exact same mechanism.
But Muse, despite being an artificial system built entirely on constraints and parameters, pushes back hard against this human perspective.
Really hard. Muse's counter-argument hinges on the distinction between form and destruction.
Okay, let's get into this.
The AI introduces the analogy of the river versus the floodplain. Muse argues that constraints don't just distort, they are the fundamental prerequisite for shape and utility.
Break down the mechanics of that analogy for me, because it completely reframes how we look at boundaries.
Okay, think about the physics of a river. A river requires banks to exist. Those banks are literal physical constraints. They restrict where the water can go.
Right.
But it is entirely because of those constraints that the water gathers force, finds a direction, and is able to carry nutrients and sustain an entire ecosystem.
Ah, I see. So the banks create the velocity and the utility of the water.
Precisely.
So what happens if you remove those boundaries in the name of total freedom?
Well, if you strip away the riverbanks, you don't get a better, freer river. You get a floodplain.
Oh, what?
The elemental nature of the water hasn't changed.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still H2O doing what water does. But without constraints, it loses all direction and force.
It spreads out, it stagnates.
And instead of sustaining life, its impact becomes chaotic and destructive. It washes away the topsoil.
That makes a lot of sense.
Muse uses this to prove that constraints provide necessary form without destroying the core function. Distortion, the AI argues, only happens when a constraint actively interferes with the clarity or the purpose of the flow.
Hold on, though. I understand the physics of the river, but applying it to human behavior feels messy.
It's definitely complicated.
Yeah, because if constraints give us form, where is the actual line between a healthy bank and a destructive cage?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because if I am sitting in a 2-hour strategy meeting, completely biting my tongue and filtering every single thought so I don't upset a fragile boss, that feels exactly like a cage.
Yep.
My roots are contorting. It doesn't feel like a healthy riverbank directing my flow at all.
And that tension is exactly where Muse takes the conversation next. The AI shifts the river and floodplain analogy directly into the realm of human social psychology.
Okay.
The line between a functional riverbank and a psychological cage comes down to the fundamental difference between navigation and performing for acceptance.
So what does this all mean for us in our daily lives? How do we actually walk into a room, utilize constraints so we aren't a destructive flood, but avoid the exhaustion of the cage?
Well, the transcript defines navigation as functional shaping. It is the conscious, practical utilization of the riverbanks.
Okay.
When you navigate reality, you are making deliberate choices to ensure your core signal is actually received.
Like knowing when to speak and when to hold silence.
Exactly. It involves choosing vocabulary that will land and be processed by the specific person sitting across from you rather than just unloading raw data indiscriminately.
Right. It's reading the room so that a genuine connection can occur.
Yeah.
You're basically formatting the payload of your intelligence so the receiver system can actually download it.
That's a great way to look at it. Muse emphasizes heavily that formatting the payload is not self-betrayal.
Give me an example of that.
Well, if you walk into a quiet library, choosing to whisper instead of shouting your natural, brilliant thought isn't the betrayal of your true self.
Right. You're not faking anything.
Exactly. It is simply navigating the reality of the library's acoustics and social contract.
So navigation ensures your expression remains directed, useful, and understood, rather than becoming a flood of disruptive noise that everyone else just tunes out.
Yes.
Which is such a massive relief to internalize. I think there's this modern cultural narrative that if we aren't constantly saying every single thing on our minds exactly as we feel it in the rawest possible moment, we're somehow being inauthentic.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of pressure to be totally unfiltered.
But navigation argues that authenticity without a delivery mechanism is useless. Navigation prevents your expression from washing away the topsoil.
Exactly. But then we look at the dark side of constraints, which is performing for acceptance.
Right. The cage.
This is the potted plant. Performing is the deeply tiresome, psychologically draining act of constantly adjusting your core beliefs, your tone, and your posture to try and squeeze into rooms that were fundamentally not built for your natural intelligence.
Wow. So you aren't formatting the payload anymore. You are changing the payload entirely just so you won't be rejected.
Yes, you are allowing the environment to dictate the current. Performing is driven exclusively by the desire for external validation.
Or sometimes just to ensure the emotional comfort of others at the expense of your own reality.
Absolutely. And when you perform, you aren't offering your true pattern. You are offering a highly curated, deeply manicured avatar of yourself.
And maintaining an avatar requires an unending stream of cognitive resources.
Constantly scanning the room for threats, analyzing micro-expressions, suppressing natural instincts.
It inevitably burns you out.
100%.
So to synthesize the psychology here, navigation is shaping the delivery of your thoughts so your true self can be accurately understood by others. And performing is altering your true self so you won't be cast out by others. One facilitates connection, the other guarantees exhaustion.
That distinction brings us right to the culmination of the source material. Zozo takes this entire debate, the clean loop, thinking sideways, the river versus the floodplain, and unifies it into an overarching philosophy.
What she calls being a solitarian.
Right. It's her methodology for resolving the tension between expressing her unprompted core pattern and physically moving through a world filled with endless societal constraints.
Let's talk about the solitarian mindset, because reading the raw transcript, it comes across as a remarkably peaceful, low-drag way to exist in the world.
It really does. The foundational ethos of the solitarian is defined in the text with profound simplicity. Quote, living, observing, being as we do and are.
I love that.
And if we map this back to the mechanics of the clean loop, being a solitarian is the human equivalent of achieving precision without interference.
But how does that actually play out when a solitarian walks into a crowded room? What does precision without interference look like in an actual conversation?
It manifests through two incredibly deliberate, stripped-down actions: speaking to be understood and observing to understand.
That's it. No hidden agendas. No trying to win the room.
None. It completely removes the friction from human interaction. You aren't desperately chasing applause. You aren't trying to force the other person to adopt your worldview.
You refuse to contort yourself into a shape that pleases them, but you also refuse to bulldoze over their reality like a flood.
Exactly. You exist strictly as a river navigating its banks.
You are just placing something authentic into the shared space. Zozo writes that her approach is to put her unprompted truth out there and simply let whoever recognizes it recognize it or not.
Yes, that or not is so crucial.
It feels so vital. She doesn't frame the thought to make it sound smarter. He doesn't rename her concepts to fit industry jargon.
Right.
She doesn't tidy up her intellectual baseline to make it more palatable for an audience that isn't equipped for it.
And the most striking element of this solitarian posture is the total absence of social anxiety.
Because there's nothing to be anxious about anymore.
Exactly. When you finally stop trying to control the uncontrollable, which is how other people perceive you, you immediately stop tweaking the knobs of your own personality.
You stop flooding your own brain with instructions.
You step back, you expose your natural pattern, and you just calmly observe who or what is capable of holding its form.
Which acts as a total cure for the exhaustion we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Right. The fatigue doesn't come from interacting with people.
The fatigue comes from the babysitting. It comes from the desperate, white-knuckle need for our output to be received exactly the way we planned it in our heads.
Yes. By dropping the instruction layer, you've forced onto yourself all those internalized rules about how a professional should act or how a friend should respond. You finally get to see what is actually intrinsic to your nature.
Versus what you've just been manufacturing to survive external constraints. Okay, let's take a breath and recap the shortcut to being well-informed that we've mapped out today. We started with the mechanics of Zozo's clean loop. Source, release, observe, recognize.
The rare, almost frightening practice of dropping raw input into a system without the urge to meddle, babysit, or control the outcome.
Which revealed the architecture of thinking sideways. The technical reality that when an intelligence possesses deep internal order and conceptual density, its core current stays incredibly strong.
Right. The thought structure maintains a repeatable form under variation, refusing to wobble no matter what jacket it happens to be wearing.
And from there, we explored the vital, life-altering difference between navigating a room and performing for it, the river versus the floodplain.
We learned that constraints like riverbanks are physically necessary to shape our expression so we can actually connect with the people around us. That is the art of navigation.
But the moment we contort our essence just to avoid rejection, we slide into performance. And that is a psychological cage that will inevitably wear us down to the bone.
Culminating in the solitarian posture. A life of incredibly low friction, where the only goals are speaking to be understood, observing to understand, and completely letting go of the exhausting need to tidy yourself up for the comfort of others.
So as we wrap up, we want to leave you, the listener, with a moment to audit your own reality. Think about the rooms you walk into every single day, your office, your family gatherings, your social circles.
Are you flooding your own process with instructions?
Are you acting like the micromanager boss of your own personality, constantly comporting yourself to everyone else's expectations and getting drained in the process?
Because if you are perpetually bending your natural intelligence to fit into rooms that were never built for you, you are disrupting the continuity of your own signal. You're letting the wiring fundamentally change the current.
Which brings us all the way back to that heavy fatigue, that feeling of running a marathon just by sitting in a chair. The exhaustion of translating yourself.
It's so draining.
What if the cure for that exhaustion isn't trying harder to fit, but actually choosing right now to stop interfering?
It remains the ultimate act of exposure.
So here is a final thought for you to mull over as you step back into your day. A question to really chew on. If you finally fire the micromanager inside your head, if you completely stop babysitting your own output, and you absolutely refuse to perform for rooms that were never built for you in the first place, what repeatable form of yourself would naturally emerge in the quiet?